From the heart of the Silicon Slopes, with a great view of the Great Salt Lake from Emperitas HQ on this rainy day, welcome to another lecture in our Dawn of the Data Age series. Today we're going to be going over data-driven sales tactics, ways to increase sales conversions. For those who are joining for the first time, I am Luciano. I'm the founder and CEO of Emperitas. We're a team of economists and data scientists who deliver bi-weekly customer lifetime value intelligence. I'm also the founder and director at the Utah Community Research Group at the University of Utah, where I teach economics classes, data science, and applied research. As we go through this, like in past lectures, I prefer if, as you have questions, you throw them up in the chat window or you unmute yourself and ask. I would ask you to just keep yourself muted until you have a question. We have someone who's monitoring those comments and questions, and they'll feed them to me, and I'd prefer that we take them as we go rather than wait to the end, but we will have a short Q&A session at the end. So like the other lectures in this series, there will be three parts today. The first is going to teach the roadblocks that sales teams hit with data. These are very predictable. They kind of cluster into two groups. There are problems that exist when there's no data available, and then there's problems that exist once the data is there. But I really want to spend more of the time talking about the different data types that are available to sales teams and the use cases for them. I think I have an uphill battle making the case to salespeople to start to use data. Of all of the groups within the organization, sales seems to lag the most when it comes to utilizing data. I'll get into some of that when we talk about the roadblocks, but I do believe most of it comes down to not believing in it, and so I hope to make you a believer by the end of today. And then I'm going to explain at the end, if you believe, how to become a data-driven sales leader and why this has such a big impact on the organization. So with the data roadblocks, it's an unfortunate situation because sales sits at the middle of the customer journey. We talk often in this lecture series about the customer journey as a framework for organizing data. If you're not familiar with it, you can go to the link that's here on this slide and you can watch a different lecture that was co-hosted with Trevor Crump from Upwell, formerly Alliance Health, where we mapped out both the customer experience version of the customer journey and then the marketing sales version of the demand waterfall on the back end. Those are just two versions of the same process, but they basically go from awareness to consideration, purchase, growth, and retention. So sales is right there at that middle point, the purchase. Often things are being handed off to sales from marketing where the awareness is being created. Sales helps nurture through the consideration to drive the purchase. But another reason this is so important beyond the middle point position is that all revenue that comes into the organization is being derived by the sales team. So unlike some of the other parts of the organization which might be cost centers, this is the sole or primary revenue center. Now, sales data is often very messy, it's often incomplete, and it's often unusable for finding actionable insights, and specifically for building predictive models. And this is in part because sales is still largely a human-to-human endeavor. So it is hard to quantify text data. We're going to get into that as one of the roadblocks. It's also hard to quantify all of the things that you might be doing as a salesperson that are happening offline or that are happening through face-to-face communication, where you then have to make notes. It's an additional step, and this seems to be a roadblock that stops a lot of data entry into CRMs. And I'll talk about why automation is the fix for that. There's also some quick fixes like just standardizing things, but until the data is there, there's really no ability to do any sort of analysis or predictive modeling. As I mentioned when we got started, all of the roadblocks that we're going to cover in this first section really fall into two distinct groupings. The first are problems that result from a lack of data. So even if there's a desire to use data, often within organizations, especially smaller organizations where there's maybe only a few salespeople on the team, this is not a data-rich environment. And there are different kinds of problems, roadblocks that result from that. And then there are problems of using the data, and I'd say that almost all medium-sized and large enterprise organizations at this point have plenty of sales data, even if it's not very clean, but it's there and it can be used. So let's go into the first of these, lacking data. I think that a big motivation behind this is that sales still runs more than any other group within the organization, with maybe the exception of executive leadership, runs on gut alone. I think executives have embraced data. There's still some who are very skeptical of it. There are some who are acutely aware to its limitations, and so they're hesitant. But they're actually trying to utilize it, and I don't see that pattern all the time in sales teams. Some of this with sales comes back to a lack of belief in the power of data, and in some cases, teams have been burned. They've tried something and it hasn't worked out. And there are really, as we get into the next section, there's some pretty reasonable explanations for why a sales data project would fail. First off, you should understand that in general, 80% of data projects are failing right now. So if you go into this as a sales team thinking that your team is going to win right off the bat with data, it's probably unlikely. You got about a 4 in 5 chance of failure. But most of the teams aren't even trying because they don't believe in data. Another that I mentioned is that things are happening offline, conventions, pitches that are in person, conversations on the phone. And unless you want to become one salesperson who we talked to recently as we did some of the qualitative interviews before we produced this lecture and some of the other research that we've done, described it as being a data entry monkey. He said, I don't want to be a data entry monkey. I don't want my job to be entering data all day. And that's understandable. Marketing has the advantage that most of what they are now doing is automatically quantified through digitization. That's true with a lot of product. If you have a SaaS product or platform, for example, almost everything that you'd want to know is being automatically captured anyways. That doesn't always happen with sales. A lot of it is offline, and there are some fixes for this. Automation is one, but a hard reality of sales is that if you want to use data, you're going to have to do some of the entry manually. And then a third, that if they do believe in data and they're willing to start to quantify things that are happening offline, what do you focus on? And this is something that is addressed in some of our other lectures. I encourage you to go read about the SMART goal system that would help you identify the kind of data that you would need to collect to start to use data in your job. But this is a big limitation for a lot of teams to overcome. What data is actually worth collecting? Just like with the projects that I mentioned, data projects fail a lot. You're not going to get it right the first time when you identify some variables that you think are worth collecting. You'll collect them, you'll analyze them, and you won't find anything of use. It's an iterative process. It is not a one and done. It will take you some time to figure out exactly what is useful. Well, what about what about sales teams who do have data? Their typical roadblocks are a lot of the data is unstructured. This is because, again, it is text data. So unstructured data means it doesn't fit quickly or neatly into pre-existing categories. Text is one of those. A lot of what sales people do, because it is human to human, is verbal or written. And this results in unstructured data, which has a growing number of analytical methods, but by far the least amount overall that are available. But the ones that are there are proving to start to be very powerful. And I would say that if you are trying to think 5 years down the road, unstructured data is probably going to be the future, not structured data. Another issue is using form fields to enter to the CRM. This is a quick fix one. This one, I don't want to say it drives me nuts, but it's one of those things that we see all the time as sales teams set up their CRM. Most of them have options to do things like drop-down menus for something like state, rather than a field form where anybody can write whatever they want. And the reason that that's important is about 50% of the time that data scientists spend is on prepping their data. It's not on actual model building. It's not on producing visualizations and output. It's on just getting data into a form where it's ready to analyze. And things like form fields where someone can enter, for example, Utah. They could type the word Utah with uppercase U. They could type the word Utah with a lowercase u. They could type UT. They could type UTA. They could type UTH. All of those are actually should be the same category. And instead, they become 4 different categories in the data set that have to then be cleaned and standardized. Setting it up so that as you enter the data into the CRM correctly at the beginning is really important. And then the third, and this is, again, like unstructured data, just a tough analytical thing to deal with, sales data is very time series in nature. Some deals can take months or years to close, and so all of the data that you're collecting over time has to be utilized in the context of time. And often what a CRM will do is it will have separate tables where past entries into a field are stored. And so if you wanted to look at something like the reason that opportunities aren't moving along, and you have 15 different entries for that opportunity, the one that's being shown in the CRM is more than likely the most recent one, but there are 14 others that you have to access through the database. So there's a time series nature to the data that makes it harder to analyze. There are plenty of analytical methods for time series. We're going to go into a little bit of them when we get into the data-driven section here at the end, but you do have to deal with the fact that this is very time series in nature. Now, whether teams have all the data they want or not, whether that data is clean or not, ready to go or not, there is I believe, another issue that plagues a lot of these sales teams, which is that they have a dependency on two polar extremes in the data maturity stages. So if you go to the link that's on this slide, it is an article that has been posted that outlines how to become data-driven in 2018, and one of the things that it talks about is identifying your place in the data maturity stages. So these really go from human reporting to dashboards to predictive models to the machine learning AI. And your organization and your team are going to have a position within that spectrum. On the very lowest end, human reporting is getting replaced right now with dashboards. And I would say that most of the organizations who are adopting dashboards do not find them to be very insightful after a few months. It's great to have some KPIs that they like everybody to have visibility into at all times, but often when you look at some metric, you want to know what's going on, and human reporting still has that advantage that you can go to a human and you can say, Adam, I need you to go back into the data now and explain why this is happening. And you can't do that with most dashboards. Tableau's trying to move in that direction, but it's still outside of the reach of most people who are using dashboards. So that's on the one end of the data maturity stages. On the other end is the AI solutions, and this is stuff like Salesforce, Einstein, the promise of a computer doing it all for you. And like any one-size-fits-all solution, right now it's not fitting anybody. And if you are not one of the top-tier organizations out there with massive, massive amounts of usable data, then AI is going to be of limited use at the present moment. And if you as an organization overall are sitting somewhere in the human reporting or dashboard stages of these data maturity, then an AI solution is going to be so above what you need that often they just get dropped after a while. And this has been the fate of Palantir. So Palantir is a AI solution that's spun off of PayPal. It's owned by Peter Thiel, does most of its work for the federal government, and has sold its product to a lot of large corporations. I think it was Hershey's, or it might have been Kellogg, that recently, might have even been Coke, who recently unsubscribed from this service because they found it too expensive and didn't see the ROI. And I think that this is in part because AI solutions are in their earliest phases, and so if you are totally dependent on them, I don't think that you're going to get what you need. Another big limitation for a lot of the sales teams, and I see this turf war, it's like the Sharks and the Jets between sales and marketing, this conflict over territory. This is really destructive to the effectiveness of data. A lot of what you're going to want to be able to do as a sales team will require data from marketing. A lot of what marketing needs to know about their effectiveness can only come after the sale and even beyond the sale into the other stages of the customer journey with retention and growth. So you have to break down this existing siloed mentality, and the first place to immediately break it down is with the marketing team. Wave a white flag, bring people together over lunch, start to figure out how to get feedback loops with that department, because information sharing there will have a very large effect on the quality of the data that you have, which will also allow for better predictive modeling and more actionable insights. Again, with the purpose of this being to increase sales conversions. Now, I'm only going into these roadblocks very quickly. If you want to read in detail about each, you can go on to LinkedIn. There's an article there posted, The Problem with Sales Data is Humans. That link will take you there. I lay out in detail what those roadblocks are like and what's causing them, what some of the solutions would be. But the majority of what I wanted to cover today, since that's already in that article, is the use cases. I want to make you a believer that sales can benefit hugely from utilizing data. In fact, I think because sales lags so far in the rest of the organization when it comes to adopting data, and because we know that most growth paths follow a logarithmic scale, it means that those earliest quick wins for the sales teams will have huge efficiency gains. And then you'll see the diminishing returns as you put more and more time into sales data. But early on, there should be some very large quick wins that you can get to as a team. Now, when I say the word data, it's kind of a catch-all. There is another lecture in this series that you can go watch. The link is down there. It starts at 2 minutes and 34 seconds, where it will explain in detail what origin, totality, scope, and measurement are. For you to be effective in data, this is a baseline understanding that you have to have. And I believe, and I've said this in other lectures, I believe that data is the next mandatory skill set. I've compared it in other places to typing. There was a point at which that everybody in the organization would hand their things off to a typist, and that typist would get them typed up. And now we're all typists. It's just expected in the job, and data is that next in-demand necessary skill set. And if you can understand that data can be sliced and diced into these 4 different ways, it will help you to identify the right kind of things to collect and the right kind of analysis to ask for. And I don't expect, by the way, that at the end of this lecture that you will be a data scientist. What I would hope is that you as individuals on sales teams would demand of your organization the same kind of support that marketing and product and customer experience and ops have, which is analysts, data scientists, and in some case developers. And if you have to communicate with those people for it to be effective, you need to speak their language. And these aren't complicated things. Origin is basically, where does this data come from? Are we entering it manually because we observed it? Are we collecting it through a survey? Are we running an experiment, an A/B test, and the data is a result of that test? That's origin. Totality is whether it's a sample or a census, and you're almost always dealing with a sample. Scope is whether it was captured over time. Well, most of your data is time series, so scope is really important to sales. And then measurement is how it was quantified. And this, if you've had a stats class, is probably what you remember as being the definition of data, even though it's only one of 4, is that almost all data, whether it's unstructured text data, whether it's continuous data, something like the actual spend and invoice amount over time, so you're looking at the average invoice amount over time, you can sum up all the invoices that you have closed, and then you can take the average of that. That's continuous data. All data is going to fit into one of these 4 groups as far as measurement goes: nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio. They allow for very different kinds of analysis. So again, I don't expect that you would do this analysis, but I would expect that you'd be able to tell your team the benefit of having ratio data over nominal data in the CRM for the purposes of analysis down the road. And this slide, like the one before it, if you go, I'll just go back, this link down here on YouTube, you can watch this video, and it explains this in detail. There's a whole lecture basically dedicated to this. But what about the use cases? And there are 5 what I consider powerful use cases. There are plenty of other use cases, and I think that there are a lot of organizations right now who are trying to figure out the best ways to utilize data for sales. From our experience at Emperitas, and we've helped a lot of sales teams, there really are 5 that have a big impact. And they are lead qualification scoring. So when something's handed off from from marketing to sales, so you get a marketing qualified lead that is then handed off for the qualification purposes on sales, and maybe it's a sales accepted lead, or maybe your system then immediately goes to a sales qualified lead. At that moment, in an ideal world, you should be able to predict whether that deal is going to close and for what amount. And you're going to be limited at that moment because different data will be available there from the next stage, which is when you start the outreach. But outreach cadence and messaging, that is ripe for A/B testing. And if you have a sufficient volume of leads, it is very easy to start to figure out what does or doesn't work. What time of day, day of week, day of month, month of year is working. What messaging in there about the product or the pricing or the features is working. The third is customizing the pitch, and this one in my opinion, has the most impact if you can do it right. If you've gotten to this point, you already have a lot of data about who they are, what they're after, and you can really customize the pitch rather than use some canned presentation. And this doesn't mean you have to make it every single time. It means that you're just tweaking what you need to do in order to increase the likelihood that the deal converts. And that gets to the next piece, which is the most important of these 5, which is predicting conversions. And like I said, you would ideally want to be able to do that all the way back at the lead qualification scoring. This means you have to do a lot of modeling. In fact, it usually requires multiple models to do it. But ultimately, this is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. The biggest ROI is knowing whether or not that lead is going to convert. And then the last one is nurturing lost deals. You're not going to close every single deal, so what's the best way to bring them back in? So I'm going to go through each of these in detail, and then I'm going to get into the last section of this, which is about how to put this into action. So use case number 1, lead qualification scoring. Using data in this process, this stage of the process, can improve efficiency by 80%. So this is massive, and this comes from the Pareto principle. We've talked about that in other lectures. There's a link coming up later about it. The Pareto principle is an economic principle that was observed by a statistician and an economist who noticed that 80% of outcomes were often being driven by 20% of a population. So in your terms, 80% of the leads that you get are not going to ultimately convert. 20% of the value of all leads is going to come from, 80% of the value of all leads is going to come from 20% of the actual leads, which means only 20% of the value comes from the other 80%. And most sales teams are happy to get a 5 to 10% conversion rate, so 20 would be out of a whole other level for them. This is actually possible if you start to utilize the data and don't just go off gut alone. And I've said this in other lectures. I don't believe that data should fully replace your gut. I think that data should be another point that you use to inform your gut. But this means that you don't stop contacting every single lead. You just do it in a strategic way. You lead score them so that you can prioritize outreach. And usually that's the pushback for lead scoring within sales teams. They say, well, everybody gets called. Well, that's great. You know, if you've got the time. I still believe that there's some leads that aren't worth calling. We've experienced that here. There's lots of people who kick tires and want to just know what's going on, and they have no intention of actually converting. And not spending time on them and prioritizing time on the leads that are most likely to convert is where you get these efficiency gains. This will require marketing data because you are often being handed a lead that you have had almost no contact with to that point. If this is where setting up the information feedback loops with marketing will have a big impact, this is all data from the awareness stage of the customer journey. There's also publicly available data that you can bring in. So this can be stuff like social. You can scrape Twitter. If you have a lead and you know the person, the Twitter API is open. You can look them up often by email or by Twitter handle. There's a lot of publicly available information that you could use to build a profile before you start outreach. So at this first moment, you can start to begin the predictive process. Is this lead worth going after because it's likely to convert at the end of this sales process? And it's likely to convert at a high value. That's the other reason to prioritize. Lead scoring is not just convert yes, no. It's convert yes, no, and at what value, and then what's the probabilities, and then you do the expected. Use case number 2, outreach cadence and messaging. Optimizing the messaging, the channel mix, so in your case, phone, email, in person, and the timing of that outreach can lift conversions by 40% or more. We have been able to consistently produce 35% lift with this specific stage, with models in this specific stage. So at this point, you now have not only the marketing data and maybe the publicly available data that you use from the qualification stage, now you're starting to get data about what is or isn't working when you're reaching out and the kind of messaging that you're using that gets a response. This requires a lot of A/B testing. There's a tendency to want to do all the things at the same time, and I think that unless you're really good at multivariate testing and you have massive amounts of data, it's just impossible. You're going to have to resort back to A/B testing, doing one thing at a time, figuring out if it works, and then updating and pivoting based on that. This stage also can benefit from competitive intelligence. If in the outreach stage they are telling you other options they're considering, or they have started to respond and they're giving you some information, that's information that you want to pass back to marketing as well. And there's a huge amount of competitive intelligence tools out there that you could add to the marketing data to improve this stage. But this is often its own model relative to the first use case. What about the pitch itself? So, like with outreach, it's possible to do A/B testing on everything about the sales pitch, and you should be looking for the key drivers behind conversions. Behavioral data, because the pitch often will happen in person or on some sort of conference line where you have video, you can get, and even just from voice, there are behavioral markers that people will signal to you with. And this is one of our favorite tactics at Emperitas. Our sales individuals never go to a pitch alone. There's always someone there with them, and that person is observing the room. And they're watching. What were the points at which they got excited? What were the points at which they grimaced? What were the things, the questions, the barriers that they brought up? And how passionate or how emotional were they about those things? All of that behavioral data that can be captured during the pitch is really, really powerful, especially for the purposes of A/B testing. It's all offline, so this is stuff you have to quantify and put back into the CRM. But it is one of the rare moments where you're going to have the ability to observe behavior beyond, the stuff that was captured in maybe digital form from marketing. This is real human behavior that you can bring in. Use case 4 is predicting the conversions. This is the ultimate goal. Any models you build at the qualification, outreach, or pitch stages should still be trying to move you toward an understanding of what will likely convert. Because once you know that, then you can use information that you might only have at the qualification stage and say, look, every lead that's coming in from this channel has a higher conversion rate ultimately, or every lead that comes in based on this specific ad set that had this specific messaging or pricing has a better pitch that converts at a higher rate. So while this is further down, the data from this will be further down your sales process, you want to use that information as much as you can to inform the earlier stages. And as I've said a few times, this really requires multiple models. It's not going to be one model right from the beginning. And this is because of the different availability of data at each of these sales stages. And then number 5, nurturing lost deals. I think a lot of salespeople are hyper-focused on the wins, and they fail to understand that there is just as much information to be gained about the losses. And not all losses are gone forever. And with retention lists are a great example of this. Often if sales teams run out of leads, they go back to their old retention list and they start outreach again. It's almost always just randomized, or they think that one deal was more likely to close than another. The nurturing stage can produce data that will help you to also prioritize the same kind of qualification and outreach and pitch again to these groups. You're basically using a new bit of information to go back through the whole process. Another piece of information, and this will be the topic of our next lecture, that is very useful for this are exit interviews. However, and I'll bring this up in the next lecture, you really can't do these exit interviews yourself. They're just, the individuals are too skeptical of your motivations. So this is good to hand off to someone else in the organization or to even use a third party. Third parties will get far better and more honest information from a lost deal than you will as an individual. But you need to indicate why a deal dropped out. And the best way to do that is to have a conversation with the individuals who are involved. And because your motivations will be called into question, they're just going to assume that you're just trying to resell. It's helpful for you to engage a third party to do that. For those who are joining us, if you have a question, feel free to jump in any moment. But if you could, please mute yourself until you have a question. Okay, so those are the 5 big use cases for data. we're getting a little bit of noise here. Give us a second.
Where did you see that?
There we go. All right. So we have so far talked about the roadblocks that teams experience, both when they have data or they don't have data. Problems getting data into CRM systems, problems with data quality and cleanliness, using field forms instead of drop-down options. We also talked about the 5 use cases from qualification through the messaging and cadence outreach, through the pitch, to the predicting of an actual conversion, and in the strategy of nurturing. Okay, those are the problems and the uses. But how do you actually go about doing this? And as I've said a couple times now, it is not my expectation to turn you into a data scientist in 1 hour. There are other lectures in our series that are available both on our website and on our YouTube page that can help you. The Interpreting Data Like a Pro lecture is a great one. Getting to Quick Data Wins is another. Creating a data culture, which was the kickoff lecture in this series, is particularly useful in that for you. But let me just mute this. We got some. There we go. Okay. But you can start to take some small steps that will have very large returns as a sales organization. So let's get into those. The first is you have to move towards standardization of your data, and you have to start to do some automation. It's not going to work well for you to just keep hoping that the data that you're putting into these CRMs through field forms and through human entry, the data monkey example that I gave you, it's not going to solve this problem. Other teams in the organization have justified hiring analysts, data scientists, and developers for the purpose largely of automating their data. You have to be insistent as a sales team to start to do the same thing. It is not hard within a CRM to track accurately outreach, the messaging of that outreach. It is not hard within the CRM to create rapid field forms that can be filled out rather than just having to scroll through and do things. The more that you can start to standardize that data entry, the better. You also need to start to bucket your data by what it impacts. So things like product features, pricing, messaging, and channel mix are a great way to organize your data so that you can, as a group, then go right to it and know exactly where it's going to be useful. And that should drive your standardization. You're going to have to get a handle on the time dimension. Sales plays out over time. There's nothing you can do about that. You're going to have to start to incorporate time series analysis into your approach. There are great models. The ARIMA model is a standard, so if you're looking for a data scientist who can help you with this, start to ask them about ARIMA models. That's ARIMA. That will also pull out the seasonality, and this is why it's useful, because there will be seasonality in your data. The month of the year, the week of the month, the day of the month, the day of the week, and even the hour of the day will all have predictive components into what's going on. And we have built models in the past that have said specifically, Tuesday at 11 a.m. is when you're having the most success reaching out, and then that outreach turns into a conversion, ultimately. So that seasonality pattern is there in the data for you to pull out. You're going to have to deal with the unstructured data. Text data is extremely powerful. This is an article from not from us, this is from another source. If you go down to that link in the bottom left, they make the case that unstructured data is the competitive advantage of the future. If you're not using unstructured data, you're going to fall behind. It requires a special set of skills, but the ROI on it is huge. One of those methods that you can start to ask a data scientist or an analyst about is natural language processing. This is stuff like sentiment, this is stuff like topic. I will warn you that most of the out-of-the-box solutions that exist right now for this require quite a bit of customization to your specific problem. I'll give you an example. We have done work with athletics teams, and traditionally natural language processing will look at a library of words that it believes are positive or negative to figure out if what's being said is positive or negative. And things like profanity, for example, are by default often categorized as negative. That is not true in the case of most sports teams. In fact, profanity is often seen is correlated, not seen, but is actually correlated with positive sentiment. And so you have to customize those libraries to your specific situation. I've mentioned this in other lectures in the series. You have to organize and interpret your data. The best way to do this is frameworks. And I believe the best frameworks are the customer journey. We've talked about that today quite a bit. Another are personas. So I am not talking in this case about sitting down as a team and saying who buys our product and then outlining what you believe to be a persona. That's a great first step, but ultimately the data needs to guide this. You should be using clustering methods and advanced analytical methods to figure out who the people actually are within these personas. And to define a persona, you need two things. You need them to be as similar as possible within that persona and simultaneously as dissimilar as possible to everyone else outside of the persona. And then the third framework that I encourage you to use is customer lifetime value. And this one's really important for sales because you are very likely giving away a lot of your rightfully earned commission because it's tied to a one-time or maybe even a recurring sale that doesn't take into consideration the full customer lifetime value. So customer lifetime value is the total value of a customer from first purchase to churn. It requires historical data, but there's also a future predictive component. So if they haven't churned yet, what's the future value, what's the present discounted value of that future stream of money that's going to come in? It should also include monetary and non-monetary things, like recommendations are a very important non-monetary component. All of that creates an actual value for that customer to the organization, and I will bet 99% odds that you are not, as a sales individual, getting compensated based on that total lifetime value. Instead, you're being compensated on single deals. And knowing that customer lifetime value is beneficial to everyone in the organization derives the most value from customers with the highest lifetime value. In fact, this is where the Pareto distribution shows up again. And I said I would come back to this. You go down to the links there in the bottom left. The Pareto principle is explained in one of our YouTube videos. 20% of the customers that your organization services will produce over time 80% of the total value. And so using that information to prioritize your lead qualification and your outreach and your pitch so that you are constantly attempting to attract the highest value customers benefits the organization. It could result in higher commissions for you. There's nothing that's lost by using this metric to guide this process. And then the last bit of advice is you have to create these feedback loops. Every department in the organization complains about their inability to work effectively with other teams. We've surveyed marketing teams, sales teams, customer experience teams, product teams, and ops teams, and leadership. And one of the constant complaints, especially around data, is that there is not an easy ability to work with the other departments. And I pointed out that the customer journey as a framework will necessitate that you take marketing data that's about awareness and consideration, competitive intelligence that's about consideration, your sales data that's about consideration and purchase, product and operation data that's about retention and growth, and customer experience data that's about retention and growth, and specifically recommendations. You need to utilize all of that information to put together an accurate picture of the customer journey, and then that information needs to be shared with each of these departments that have these differing and sometimes overlapping domains across that framework of the customer journey. So by creating a feedback loop, and let me give you an example. In fact, that lecture, let's go back one more slide, this lecture on the Pareto principle is about marketing data specifically, and it's about constructing this from a reverse standpoint. So you start with something like a purchase. You can even go one step further. You could say, we're going to actually look at whether they are recommending and retaining and purchasing again. And then we're going to figure out their path through the customer journey by looking at the sales process that worked for them, the consideration that they did, and the marketing that was driving it. And from that, you can then start to grow that Pareto persona, that high value, high customer lifetime value segment. Because if all you're doing is marketing to people who have a very, very low acquisition cost, but who do not convert at any sort of meaningful rate, or once they do convert, aren't really happy with the product and don't retain and don't recommend, that money spent at the beginning of the funnel is not very effective. It'd be far more effective to know who are these ideal best customers and how do we reach them? What's the channel mix? What's the messaging? What's the product? And what's the price? So let's sum up, and then we can go to questions if anyone has some. We have covered today the roadblocks that sales teams typically hit with data. You can also go read about those in more detail on that LinkedIn article that was cited in a few slides back. We talked about the data types and uses for better sales conversions. So the different ways to define data, the different kinds of measurement of data, and then how to use data in those 5 highly effective situations of qualification, outreach, pitch, predicting the conversion, and then nurturing. And then we talked about how to become a data-driven sales leader by getting a handle on unstructured data, bringing time series analysis into this, breaking down the silo barriers in the organization and creating those feedback loops. One last tip that I would offer you is you should start small. I think this is where a lot of people make mistakes with data. I think this is why 4 out of 5 data projects fail. There are these huge wish list items that teams have, and as a result, they build these incredibly complex systems that require huge amounts of time, labor, and money. And they're often not very focused, and so they don't succeed. And then people say, oh, this is why we didn't believe in data to begin with. Well, you set yourself up for failure. You need to get to quick wins. Quick wins require small problems. Small problems can fit into a bigger framework, but they should be small problems. And this is where I encourage you to go read about the SMART goals. This is something we've written about extensively on our blog. This is something that's in many of the videos. The getting to quick data wins starts off with the SMART goals process. Any project we ever take on at Emperitas always begins with that. Well, we have a kickoff call where we explain our process, and then the next thing we do is we get all the people in the room who matter, so the decision makers, the stakeholders, and our linchpin is the person that we call the individual who's going to be working with us, and we say, okay, what is it that you don't know? What is it that you want to learn about? We really have to narrow that down. And then from there, okay, well, what data is available that would inform that? And then if we were able to get the information for you, how are you going to act on it? We're not going to just go chase anything. We need to know how you're going to act on it because that's going to inform the way we approach it. And there's a whole series of steps that you take as a team to identify individual problems and ways to solve them, measures of success, who the directly responsible individuals are, the time frames involved. Then you can prioritize those and you can attack them one at a time. And I encourage you to go for the quickest win possible right off the bat. Because once you start to see some gains from doing this process, it's easy to get people to believe in data. And I said at the beginning that this is the problem that sales teams face. They largely just do not believe in data. It's why they don't want to spend the time being a data entry monkey and putting things into the CRM. It's why they don't want to look at the results and believe that they're useful. It's why the underlying data is so dirty and hard to model. It's because ultimately, if you distill it all back down, there is this skepticism around data that just is prevalent through most sales teams. And some of it is because of failed past attempts. So find something that would be a quick win, get to that, demonstrate the effectiveness, and then iterate. We talk about agile methods all the time at Emperitas. We utilize them ourselves. The last lecture was about customer research for product managers, and it was built on an agile framework that takes 1 month. This is not a one and done process. It will take some time for you to figure out what data to collect, why it's worth collecting. It'll take you some time to get to the big wins, but if you can show one quick win, it's amazing how much that creates momentum for the rest of the process. With that, we'll open up to any questions. We had one on here earlier that said, let me read it. So what is the biggest obstacle with the qualification stage? It's just a lack of data. So when I laid out those 5 use cases, they are cumulative in the kind of data that you'll have. So when you first get a lead from something like marketing, you have a minimal amount of information. From that point forward in the sales process, you are adding cumulatively more and more information. And so while I have encouraged you to your ultimate goal should be At that qualification stage, can we predict with high confidence the likelihood of a conversion and the value of that conversion down the rest of the sales path? It's going to take a series of models at each of those use case stages to do it because of the limitations in data. And what we have found as a solution to that problem is to include a lot of offline, or not offline, but publicly available data sets. They're things that you're not necessarily collecting on those individuals. So this would be implicit data, data that is out there that you didn't necessarily collect, and now you're going to be able to make it explicit by tying it to an individual. The best examples of that could be census data. So often if you're getting leads, you might know their geographical location. You may not know something like their credit score, but you can go look up in national databases that zip code, that area, and the average credit score. And then you can start to utilize that information. I talked about social media. There's so much information that people put out there about themselves in social media. I would say that one of the quickest wins that you could get as a sales team is to just at that stage, at the qualification stage, utilize everything you can get from marketing about those individuals, and then go to the public domain and figure out everything you can get about that individual in particular. And then once you have those two pieces, add anything else that's available from a national database standpoint to create as complete a picture as possible to prioritize and lead score so that you can still call everybody, but you do it in a systematic way. Like I said, we have seen 35 to 40% lift just by doing this and customizing some of the messaging as you start to do the outreach. Other questions? All right, looks like that's it for today. So the next lecture that will happen in 2 weeks is Sales Hacks with Market Research. I mentioned earlier that exit interviews for the nurturing use case of data in sales really depend on whether or not you know how to do research. And I still encourage you to have someone else in your organization do those exit interviews, but this will focus largely on how to collect secondary information, how to do competitive intelligence, and how to do qualitative interviews, which we call customer conversations, which exit interviews would be a component of, so that you can start to include some of this data back into your CRM and build those more predictive models to figure out who's going to convert and at what highest customer lifetime value.